Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along to today's webinar. We will get started in just 2 minutes. Wait for the last few people to come on board. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming along, everybody, to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about SharePoint migration to Office 365 or Azure, or SharePoint migration more generally, as the case may be. My name is Garrett Griffin, and I am a solution specialist for OBS, now come Empired. And with me is Andrew Jolly, a principal consultant for the Brisbane branch, and also an information management guru. Say hello, Angie.
Hello. Guru is a little bit of a stretch, thank you, Garrett. So I'll take it.
So today's discussion is going to focus on migration, and it's going to focus on SharePoint migration explicitly, although we may touch on a few other generalities. Just in terms of positioning, we're going to do our best to run between 45 and 60 minutes today. It's been interesting in preparing the content for today, seeing just how broad a topic we've undertaken here. We'll do our best to get through the important bits. I guess positioning it more broadly, this is focused on the business end, not the technical, although there may be a few technicalities that we do discuss towards the end. And more importantly, this is AJ and I's attempt to begin the process of digesting the numerous conversations that we have with our customers and with the marketplace in general regarding the issue of migration, as well as SharePoint-specific migrations.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago we were planning on throwing some ideas around about what we would discuss and what we'd point out, and it's a very broad landscape. So what we thought we'd do is just bring together some of the most common things that we're talking about with our customers in general day-to-day dialogue. Some of these things are popping up in the requests for services that we have to offer, and just random conversations. And I mean, some of them are points of worry and concern. Some of them are questions of advice and seeking input from us. So really today is a bit of an encapsulation of some of these main things that we just wanted to share with our wider customer community, and hopefully start the thinking process for you as well around those things.
Very much around positioning and approach, because of course, as we all know, the things we don't get right in our approach and our positioning projects for success are the things that butterfly effect into problems later. So with that, I guess the last logistics are we will be taking questions through the GoToWebinar questions panel you should have access to. Feel free to park your questions there, and we'll try and preserve some time to get through those towards the end. Otherwise, we'll be following up the webinar with all of the materials and answers to the questions explicitly to the entire audience. So with that, I guess the first thing we'd like to position is that migration is a very broad concept with a wide number of considerations, particularly in the SharePoint context. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to migrating into SharePoint or from SharePoint to SharePoint. And in fact, even that is an oversimplification of the number of SharePoints that we can actually move into when we're looking at taking our workloads to the cloud. The other key point here is that while it may seem daunting, given the sheer number of variables that we have to evaluate as we approach this problem, that initially may actually create quite a bit of apprehension, we'd like to point out that the issues are those that you're going to encounter regardless of the type of migration that you're undertaking. Upgrades and redesign, restructure, reorganizing our information management, and moving our content and our workloads and our behavior from point A to point B is always going to be a complex problem. And this is probably the first most important aspect of the approach positioning today, is to keep a very open mind and to treat migration projects very discreetly and with kid gloves. So in terms of trying to establish a broad agenda for today, we are going to attempt to talk about all things approach, all things positioning. We're going to talk about information assessment and feature analysis, and we're also going to talk about some of the tooling options that are available as we look to make workload changes. We're going to talk throughout across a number of different change management considerations that we feel are critically important to understand. And we're going to try and get through a couple of common scenarios as we go along as well. Now, to guide us in generalizing a migration process, we'll use the following. We believe that first and foremost we need to establish a clear business case and approach, and we're going to talk at length about that today. We need to conduct an information assessment, and we're going to very much expand on what that actually means today. We possibly, if we're considering redesign or deltas between point A and point B, we have some new architectures to design and to consider. Naturally, as we get close to actually running our migration or our process, we've got tooling and testing considerations. Then we actually conduct the migration, and then importantly, there are some things that we have to do after we think we're done. So we'll try to cover some key value points across each of those project phases as we talk through it today. Starting with approach. Thanks to my fuzzy editing job, what you can't see there is actually a landing strip on a small hill. Pardon the image work there. So before we actually set dates and budgets for a project, there are naturally some very important things we need to consider. How do we set our approach to migration? How do we even begin to tackle this problem? As with every project that we undertake, we believe firmly that understanding the drivers and the desired outcomes must come first. Sometimes it's easy because of executive mandate or market pressure to take these things for granted. Don't. We have to take the time to understand the drivers and the desired outcomes of a move to the cloud for any workload very carefully. It is the only way that we're going to be able to measure our return on investment, and is the only way that we are going to position the context of the wider organization correctly. We also need to understand the as-a-service models. Now, everybody at some point in the last few years has seen the stack diagram of NIST as-a-service models, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, etc. But we really do need to take a moment to understand those models and what they mean for our organizations. We may have time to touch on some of those today. We need to work to quantify potential costs and benefits. Now, quantifying costs and benefits up front can actually be quite a tricky thing. There are a lot of assumptions involved, but we need to make at least an effort to provide some quantification of those. We also need to map the constraints and dependencies that are going to govern our project. We need to understand that migration projects, for example, may not be able to be constrained by a simple business deadline. They're going to take the time that they take, and they're going to move according to what the business deems as the least disruptive process. And we need to take this into account when we're doing our planning and looking at the dependencies between other projects. We need to develop collective sponsorship. This is critically important. We're going to talk about this repeatedly throughout today's discussion. Engaging our stakeholders, engaging our users throughout this process is just as important with migration as it is any other kind of software-related project. Their engagement is going to be a key determiner in the kind of success that we have and the kind of workloads that we're able to move ultimately successfully. There are naturally a number of questions that surround these broad concepts, things that when we're looking specifically at SharePoint migration, we need to be asking ourselves, things like, Do we, do we move without an upgrade, or are we facing an upgrade as part of this process? Do we likewise take this as an opportunity to reorganize our information or to redesign our functionality and user interfaces, or do we take it as a like-for-like move? Are we happy to consider changes to the functionality that are made available to us? Not all SharePoints are created equal out here in the world, and whether we're choosing to move to SharePoint Online or to a hosted on-premises style instance, or even a managed platform as a service instance of SharePoint, there are going to be deltas and differences in the way it behaves, and specifically with Office 365, with the feature sets that are exposed to us. And I think you would concur with that, AJ.
That's right. Yep.
We have other questions. Are we actually going to be saving any money? Let's put it simply. There are lots of promises out there about the cloud, and it's a very trendy thing to talk about right now. But are we actually, over the cost of ownership, over the lifetime of our solution, are we actually saving money? Or are we merely just redistributing those costs and those burdens in a different way? Given some time, we'll take a deeper look at that.
Yeah.
So there are a number of questions that will guide us, and these are the kinds of questions that we should have at a discussional level right from the very beginning. It's important not to frame our projects as purely a technical project. Migration is not a technical project. It is a whole of organization business process change project. And that's a better way to view it. It's going to allow us to have these conversations and to start asking questions that help us understand our organizational preferences in a better way. So, extending on that, we'll draw an analogy. This is a very crude, rudimentary analogy. On the left, we have arguably the best, most cost-effective, easy-to-run utilitarian vehicle ever created by mankind. And in fact, that looks not too dissimilar from the one that I owned years ago. On the right, we have a public transport system that's centrally managed, offers tremendous scale, allows us to refocus our time and energy, and potentially even reduces our costs. But again, similar to the things we've pointed out, there are going to be a number of questions. We might be able to reduce our individual running cost, but do we also lose some control? And the answer is probably yes if we're moving into shared environments. We might increase our capacity, but we have to accept sharing that capacity with others. We might be able to refocus our energies. For example, I can now read the newspaper or a nice book as I'm riding the train, but I now have to place more trust in the skills and the ability, the reliability of others to be able to run that infrastructure for me. Ultimately, the business case that we establish is going to be about breaking down our individual organizational preferences and needs and putting them in the context of a cost-benefit analysis. And this is an important step not to skip and not to shortchange. We really need to have these conversations deeply at the very beginning of any cloud migration discussion. If we feel that we've had those discussions and we are now moving into an assessment period, let's break down what kinds of things we mean by information assessment. Most customers that we deal with who are facing cloud migrations, for example, will, let's take a non-SharePoint example. They're going to move their file shares up into, well, they think they're going to move them into OneDrive, which is a fallacy. They start by running tools like tree size and looking at file names and file types and file volumes, and this is a good starting point. But for us, information assessment means much, much more. Information assessment is about evaluating all the information that we have, the information that we want, and more importantly, the way that we use it, the behaviors that we currently exhibit, and the desired end state for the behaviors that we're anticipating from a move to the cloud, if any.
It's about wrapping the context around the information and the content that you have. The much deeper and more enlightening conversations and planning can take place if you're understanding the context within which you're trying to work in or move information around, and that's something we like to focus on with people when we're discussing approaches to migration.
Presuming we're coming from an existing SharePoint environment, we all know, irregardless of the version, that SharePoint is, it does more than one thing. It offers dozens and dozens of individual tools and capabilities that we can assemble into productive business solutions, ranging from simple publication intranets through to full controlled document management solutions and more. Can be extended in many different ways. So there are a wide variety of behaviors and functionalities and content types that are involved. We really need to get in and understand, first and foremost, what's in there. And this goes so far beyond volumes and sizes. It goes into behavior, and it goes into the way that people interpret that information, how often they use it, and a number of other issues. And it's about identifying and beginning the process of identifying the gaps or the increments in functionality that we're going to experience if we change platforms, with or without a version upgrade. We need to understand that there are going to be functional differences between, for example, our old 2010 SharePoint on-premises installation and what's offered to us in a SharePoint on lawn environment, which is evergreen currently at 2013 version, but in a constrained way because it's a shared service where we have perhaps less exposure to the administrative capabilities that we would on-premise. We need to ask the questions, are there new capabilities that we are going to gain? Are we going to be faced with decisions to replace old functionalities with something better? Are we going to lose features? Will features behave differently even if they come across? Not all SharePoints are created equal. That's the bottom line. More importantly, we need to make some clear decisions about what content needs to come. If we're facing a wholesale move of a SharePoint environment, then maybe that answers itself very quickly. But every migration project is an opportunity for change. It's an opportunity to clean, to delete, to archive, and to ensure that we're following the principle of not moving things that don't need to be moved. Now, some people avoid this discussion like the plague because it means they've actually got to get their hands dirty and get in there and look at the content and deal with the content that they haven't been choosing to deal with for the last decade. But it's a good idea to do so because ultimately the cost model and the time frames and the success of our migration project are in part dependent on the amount and the kinds of content that we're going to choose to move. If in an extreme example, you've got old accounting package files for a piece of accounting software that isn't even supported anymore, do you really need to move that into the cloud, or is there an opportunity to archive that offline, particularly given that the client to access that information doesn't even exist anymore? These are valid questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's often when people are moving into a cloud environment is that the costs seem very low. People have a quota of storage per user that amounts to an organizational quota and that sort of thing. But you don't want to be burning that quota up and consuming that quota with files that you're never going to be accessing again. Pretty soon, in a number of years, you'll be starting to pay extra for storage, and so really to look the other way and not deal with it up front and center is really deferring the cost. One, in time, you're deferring time that you'll take to get rid of old stuff first. You're deferring that to effectively possibly a monetary cost in the first few years if you start to grow your content exponentially. And that's probably an exercise in preparation as well as to is when looking at data and information and growth, is to look at when you put your existing SharePoint environment in place, how long did it take to accumulate the amount of content that you have now? It's not uncommon. We've heard terabytes of data being created in a matter of years, and that continues to be the trend. I think most people need to be comfortable with that fact. So, in a nutshell, being mindful about what you're taking across is an important step to get the most out of your agreements and costs from day one.
And of course, as with any migration project, particularly for structured data, cleanliness of the information, relevance of the information factors into this. And it's another reason why it's so important to bring users and other stakeholders into the discussion about migration early on and involve them in that remediation process.
The business are the people that will make these decisions. They have to make these decisions. It's not a case of saying, this stuff's old, we're not taking it. It needs to be a conscious decision-making process with people that are the custodians of that information.
So one more thing that we would say is that in the process of evaluating information from this perspective, from a behavioral perspective, we're really getting a good look at the current state of our business processes. Now, again, this might be uncomfortable if we haven't bothered to take a look at our business processes for the last decade, but ultimately it's going to be a cleansing process for those as well. We're going to quickly find gaps in terms of our business process caused by a migration project. It's one of the kinds of projects that can do that. And it's going to cause us to face them in a way that we need to evaluate whether they're going to impact the business case that we've established for migration. In fact, we have seen cases where a gap identified in business process that either was understood and not dealt with or just not understood at all can cause a delay or a resequencing of the intentions to move to the cloud. That in fact it can become important to resolve those business process issues first before transferring them into a different environment. And that's good advice. Lastly, we need to consider the information that we manage in terms of taxonomy and metadata. Depending on the source system, if it's SharePoint, we're likely using some form of metadata in the way that we manage lists and libraries. That's great. But there's also metadata in file shares. There's certainly metadata in RM systems and other unstructured content systems that we may be linking to. We need to understand that metadata model because controlled information or controlled metadata forms a very important part of moving into the later SharePoint platforms. It's in fact quite critical to getting the most out of search and the most out of navigation and some of these other elements. Depending on how old the system you're coming from is, this might actually be a bit of a transition.
And to put that to provide an example of that, if you were to drag a file from a file share into a system like Office 365 or online instance SharePoint, it's going to assume that the created date of that file is today. And what that means from a search perspective is that if you are looking to use some of the filters for search which help people discover content that was created a while ago or authored at a certain time, we might find that the search algorithms are not quite understanding exactly the real date of when that was created. So when we look at metadata like that, we can then say, well, some of that information is important to us, and so therefore tool selection migration tool selection, which we'll chat about later, will be a factor there when we're considering what you're going to tools you need to move that information across with its inherent metadata. So metadata, it is an important concept, particularly for these moves.
So just to underscore the concept around how to approach remediation, depicted on your screen now is a traditional approach coming out of the days of ETL and traditional data migrations. Let's migrate it, then let's worry about archiving and reducing and deleting content. What we would like to offer to you that in fact the opposite is the better way to go, particularly when we're dealing with cloud-based migration. Delete everything you can. Use it as that opportunity to clean house. Spring cleaning is a good thing. Where we need to archive because we perhaps, for example, have a retention obligation from compliance burden, we can look to then additionally reducing what's going to be migrated by archiving it. And there are a number of options for archival processes that have, in many cases, still nothing to do with the cloud, although there are options in the cloud as well for that kind of storage. And then ultimately what we're left migrating is the minimum amount of content possible. Well, why does this matter? Well, in some regards it may be obvious. It's a smaller workload to migrate a smaller package of content. But what's more important is that there are costs associated with this. There are risks associated with your migration project itself. Whether you're doing shotgun or a separated and batched process, if you are subject to moving things over network connections, internet connections, every one of those batches introduces risk that the connection is going to go down. There's going to be a solar flare that interrupts the connection and you've got to start over again. So the least amount of content is going to significantly or even geometrically in some cases shrink the actual migration time frame and workload down. Every megabyte that you can save potentially pays for itself tenfold under some circumstances. So very, very important to embrace this. Conduct the remediation now. And as it happens, it's the best way to get the baseline or the frontline employees involved in this discussion. if it's positioned correctly. So let's take a little bit of detail. We've talked about how typical approaches might look at file types and sizes, but here's a smattering of concepts about characteristics that we really want to understand for files, and it also applies equally to non-file-based content. Ultimately, we need to understand the usage and the life cycle of the content more than anything, because types and sizes will have set limitations. Volumes have to be managed in particular ways in a SharePoint context. If you're coming from an existing SharePoint environment, you already know this. Lists and libraries do have item limits, and there are maximum file sizes. You're familiar with it. If you're coming out of file share, you've got a whole wonderful world of learning ahead of you in terms of how to deal with batching up the content in ways that get around these problems. And you're moving your bulk stored content into topologies that will help you organize smaller bins effectively. So we're also looking at metadata. We're looking at the existing structures and topologies in SharePoint, making decisions as to whether they're going to come over wholesale, whether they aren't, whether we need to rework those topologies, site structures. We're looking at the individual databases if it's a straight SharePoint move. We're, above all, examining whether or not a like-for-like move is going to give us an opportunity in a non-Office 365 setting to do a simple detach and attach database move. If that's all the content you have and the customization level is low and you're headed into essentially an on-premises capability or installation type, maybe this is an option and you don't have to work at the individual content level. I would actually argue, and we'll get AJ's opinion on this, that we don't actually encounter many of those anymore. Most of the migration work that we've done in, let's say, the last year has actually been more about moving blocks of content into a new topology and taking advantage of new version features this way. It's not a wholesale move at all. It's actually a very, very selective process tied to a redesign of the intranet or the application that we're moving.
Yeah, I think most organizations do take the opportunity to restructure, relook at something. There's always room for improvement, and I think many people realize that the opportunity to make those improvements is an important one during these phases. They can bring that change of structure, change of interface through the process and sort of make that easier on people in one go. Well, you could argue it doesn't, but you could argue that it does. But generally you find very few organizations are doing straight upgrades in favor of shifting things around, reorganizing things, renaming things, splitting things out. It's more or less the way it goes.
One of the things that we find ourselves talking about repeatedly, especially more recently as more and more people are looking to move their workloads to the cloud, has to do with the fact that our older storage paradigms, particularly when we're coming from file shares into a SharePoint environment, is often devoid of the use of metadata or taxonomy-driven approaches to containership, naming, and organization. So, as an example, the amount of metadata that's available on a file sitting in an NTFS file share is extremely limited by comparison to what we have the ability to manage in terms of business context metadata up in the SharePoint environment. What we'll find is that people are blindsided by the fact that most of their metadata is actually incarcerated. It's imprisoned inside folder names, naming formats, and conventions, and in some cases in header information even embedded in the Word documents or Excel documents manually. So we have this issue of looking at whether we are going to try to move that metadata into the management mechanisms that SharePoint gives us. It's pertinent for some kinds of migration, but it's something that we need to be aware of as we approach all of them. How are we going to manage that discussion? How are we going to manage that move? Lest we forget, we also need to be very conscious of the security and the permissions that are being applied to content and to site structures as well. Now, in a wholesale SharePoint move, groups can be equivalated to groups, and much of that can be carried across depending on the type of migration you're doing.
Correct.
But if we're looking at non-SharePoint sources, we may have to evaluate the permissions and security model even down at an Active Directory or an NTFS permission level to really understand how to map that into a SharePoint context.
Yeah, not something to be underestimated. File shares can be a bit of a rabbit warren when it comes to permissions, and just generally because they've been in place for so long. A lot of the changes and configurations that are made for security and file shares can be quite historic. So, very, very not necessarily a straight mapping. So it is important to realize that and to think about security accordingly. If I move a bunch of files from the file share into a new site collection, is it okay that everybody sees them? What security configuration do I need to do once they're in there? I don't think there's really a need to try and plan all that up front. I think it's a very, very big task to do that. That is constantly changing underneath you if you're attempting to do it ahead of time. But it is something you can do during the process of migration and following the content having been moved in. But it's a case of just being ready to do that and working with the business to secure things down quickly, rapidly, or timely. It's probably the right word there.
Mm. Yeah. You will hear AJ and I talk quite a bit about incrementalism. We're big fans. Last but not least on this list is the accessibility of the content itself. Regardless of whether it's SharePoint or coming from any other system into SharePoint, we need to ensure that the transport mechanism, the accessibility to actually get to the content, to lift it up, handle it, evaluate it, move it, or in some cases even transform it, is there. Now that may be as simple as pulling things off file shares using third-party tools, or it could be as complex as writing custom tooling to draw data directly out of proprietary databases. We've seen all of these cases in the last 2 years, certainly. Now, that's just the content. We also have a number of other issues with SharePoint that we have to look at. We need to understand, if we're coming from an existing, what the current IA and topology looks like and how we're using that, as we've talked about. We do need to be conscious of the version that we're coming from and the service app differences that may exist. If we're coming from older versions into 13, or we're coming from older versions or even like versions into SharePoint Online, there are changes to the service app landscape. As one example, if I'm on premises with SharePoint 2013, I have as much control as I want over how the search service runs and how it crawls and how it's configured. It's a full on-premises capability. Move that to SharePoint Online, we actually lose a little bit of that capability. It's managed by Microsoft for the benefit of the wider community. They're looking at their loads and performances and their crawl schedules according to their needs or the needs of the wider community. So there are these little differences. We'll also find that some of the administrative interfaces that we have access to have changed. They're different screens, so we have a little bit of a learning curve there as well. We've talked about metadata. This includes content types and site columns. These are landscapes that need to be understood and potentially reevaluated or reconciled or remediated if there's an opportunity to do so. We most certainly need to be looking at extensions and integrations. Now, this is actually a pretty wide category. Questions. Do we have third-party add-ons installed in our current environment that will or won't need replacement or won't work at all inside of the new environment? If we're moving to SharePoint Online, this can be a consideration. They have a different model for how third-party extensions are expressed inside of the environment through the app model. So you'd be looking for replacement or like-for-like replacements into the app model for some tools. Have we done any custom work to our environment? And this can range from packaged solutions that have been installed and deployed to site collections all the way through to evaluating the client-side code approaches that have been taken on some pages. If those client-side constructs are not ready to interact with the client-side capabilities that are available in SharePoint Online, we've got some refactoring we need to do. And lest we forget integrations. Are there any lines of integration for structured or unstructured content to our line of business systems? This is critical. These have to be evaluated and effectively unraveled. And in many cases, particularly if we are using enterprise, on-premise enterprise service buses or custom integration packages to perform our data integrations, particularly if they're transactional, we have a huge refactoring task that we need to look at to bring that to life in the new environment. And in fact, we should be evaluating whether it's even necessary at all.
A couple of examples of that might be, you may be using employee ID numbers coming from third-party HR systems that are informing workflows or informing the user profiles service in SharePoint, and that's something that you'd need to consider if you do have that integration going on. And another example, just fresh one that I had in mind. It'll come to me in a moment.
We certainly see examples where finance systems and HR systems have content coming through.
CRM systems and so on. That's
CRM, absolutely.
Yeah, the single point of authority for client names and so on like that used in automation or creation of, say, cases or issues that you're dealing with. So those are the things that commonly we see as integrations with using business data connectivity services and so on, and they would all need to be looked at and addressed independently, one by one. And it's safe to say it's probably not going to work. Don't expect anything to work immediately. I think everything needs to be addressed, and it needs to be expected that reconfiguration will be required in some shape or form to some degree.
Not the least of which relates to security and identity. It's not necessarily an integration as such, but we can kind of view it the same way. At the end of the day, when we log into our current SharePoint environment, we're not logging in at all generally. We're authenticated through our Active Directory presence on our network, and I'm not challenged for a password at all. I merely access my intranet. When we move to the cloud, we are moving outside of that security context, and we have the questions. Where are the identities going to come from? How are they going to be accessed? Are they going to be synchronized or federated? Are we creating trust relationships? And how are we going to broadly answer the question, how do I want my users to log into this new instance of the system out there? And that's certainly a technical question that needs to be discussed and talked about right up front. There can be implications and additional work required to effectively stretch your current capability or your current security context in a way that interacts properly with your target environments. We won't go deeper than that on technicalities today, as it does become quite a deep conversation. We also need to look at workflow and forms. Workflow, both native and third-party, will often need to be migrated discreetly, particularly in the case of third-party. And we need to look at little niggly things like administrator-deployed InfoPath forms and the potential that there is code behind running inside those forms. There's a number of subordinate issues where those customizations or custom code might come to play. We need to evaluate each of those to find out if there's a compatibility in the target environment. And in fact, when we start to find that there are a lot of customizations and niggly bits, we start to actually, begins to inform our choices in terms of deployment options away from SharePoint Online and more to either an IaaS or PaaS-based SharePoint deployment, private hosted effectively. And there's more. Are we changing namespaces? This is particularly poignant if you happen to be stuck in moving an Office 365 SharePoint to an Office 365 SharePoint. Your namespace, your domain, can only be active and mapped to one tenant at any one given time. So the timing and the sequencing of your migration activity makes that the center point. The switching of the domain name becomes the anchor around around which all other activities have to be scheduled. Kind of an interesting point. The same thing can apply in other circumstances. Are we aware of the licensing changes? Office 365 SharePoint Online is completely subscription-based, whereas hosting in Azure on a VM or through a private hosting arrangement is still going to imply that we have server and CAL licensing in place. Sovereignty issues are less of an issue these days. We have the ability, if there is any compliance reason for us to keep our data onshore, we can actually do so now with 365, with Azure, and with onshore private hosting capabilities. But it's still worth understanding what those boundaries and constraints are. Are there other compliance constraints? We have seen cases where there is an agreed contract between third parties with clauses that would stipulate that the data shall not move outside of thy premises. And these things do exist, and that landscape needs to be understood before we really start making commitments on the migration to the cloud. We've talked about feature fit. As there are so many features possible in the SharePoint environment, we do really need to understand what's going away, what's coming on, what can be replaced, and there's a bit of a gap analysis that needs to be performed there. This is pretty critical, actually. There are potentially changed limits. Anybody who's used to working with SharePoint knows there are, as we mentioned, list and library limits. There is really good information up at TechNet that describes SharePoint 2013 item limits, as well as the subset of those that apply to the shared environment of SharePoint Online. And lest we forget, there are skill changes. As we make this move, we are changing interfaces potentially. We are changing operational environments. And we're changing, in some cases, the way that people are going to authenticate or log into the system. And the focal point here that I think AJ and I particularly wanted to call out is that from a cultural standpoint, often migration to the cloud comes with a lot of fear, particularly from technical staff thinking, well, my job's going to go away because it's all platform as a service based now. We would argue the opposite, that whilst there is going to be a change in focus for these individuals, they're going to become more needed than ever. It's just that they're going to have to learn a little bit more about contract management, and more importantly, they're going to have to learn about contract management in many cases in the context of consumable services as opposed to traditional procurement of things. And this is a subtlety, but it can be an important one, and for some people a hard transition to make.
Yeah, and it's not saying that every server administrator becomes a contract manager, but it's a shift of focus, and the skills needed to do and operate these platforms are still deep and in depth, and you might find an emphasis on monitoring and a different emphasis on monitoring and tracking and watching consumption and use and different methods of troubleshooting. The integrations that are in place, the interaction between the VPNs that may be connected. So I think the fears are kind of, they're understandable within some of these, with a lot of technical infrastructure-based staff. But after a few conversations, it almost goes the other way. They get a bit scared as to how much there might be needing to be done and continue to be done. So opportunities are abound for everyone, I think, and I don't necessarily think that it's a case of, oh, we're going to downsize teams immediately once we put something in the cloud. In fact, I've yet to see that actually happen in any of the interactions I've had with existing clients. So.
This next slide I decided to toss in today just because I thought it offered a little bit of value. It's a little bit lower level than we're talking today, but in terms of the types of customizations in SharePoint that we would be looking for prior to an actual migration, we've sort of canvassed what they are at a high level, but I thought this was a pretty good visual depiction of some of the kinds of customization, or the areas where customizations can take place, and what kind of impact that they can have. But we won't belabor that. Feel free to peruse that or ask questions about that. We'll send the slide deck around to everybody. So, once we have a bead on the behaviors, the information, the gap analysis, and we've begun to form this model of both the current and a desired future state, we now have a lot more information to help us decide what our deployment options are to the cloud. Broadly for SharePoint, they fall into some pretty simple categories. We can either find that we have a suitable fit in functionality and offered experiences to utilize SharePoint Online as part of the Office 365 subscription process. SharePoint Online is going to be subscription-based, not full license-based. It means that it's going to be evergreen, and Microsoft controls when those updates take place. It is available onshore as of this year. And it's also, depending on how we configure that user experience for the Office 365 portal itself for the user, it's going to bring a number of other capabilities. Office 365 is so much more than SharePoint Online. In fact, they don't even refer to SharePoint Online anymore. They refer to it as team sites. So we have a number of other capabilities out of the scope of today's discussion that come with Office 365. Most of you will be at least somewhat familiar with those, if not intimately familiar with them. So we are introducing the user into a new environment, effectively, that is wrapped with a number of other tools and environments that they may or may not have been exposed to yet. We need to think carefully as we approach SharePoint Online as to how much of that we expose them to and when. And often this means developing a secondary rollout schedule as to when we'll expose some of those other Office 365 capabilities. Now, there are private cloud options. You can still hire a VM or a physical server in a rack, and you can create a SharePoint farm, and you can have that hosted onshore or off, and you can manage that in traditional ways. What would make it a cloud offering, according to the strictest definitions, would be the following. First of all, that the resource assignment on the VM or the physical could in some way be dynamic and what they refer to as elastic. So the elasticity of the resource assignments, the scalability of the performance of that infrastructure is part of what makes it a cloud offering. Also, there are specific technologies that make it cloud as well. There may be services wrapped around that infrastructure, and there may be a service offering in the way that it is managed for you that qualifies it to earn the label cloud. So we'll leave that there. Now, then we come to Azure. Now, Azure is still, remarkably amongst our client base, a misunderstood or not very well understood set of services. Very broadly, Azure is a toolkit. It is Microsoft's leading investment in cloud technology and in as-a-service offerings. Azure is dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds by now, of individual tools and features ranging from simple infrastructure as a service offerings all the way through to software as a service offerings now, that we should view as a toolkit, as an environment and a toolkit where we can begin to move workloads, create new workloads, connect things. So traditionally, if we were going to move SharePoint out to somebody else, we might look at that private cloud option. Azure roles, in addition to VMs, give us several options to do the same thing in a Microsoft context. If we're just going to use VMs, well, we can spin those up, and in fact, SharePoint has a template in the VM library. It's almost, this is an oversimplification, but it's almost as easy as clicking a button to spin up a SharePoint environment in the VM settings in Azure. But more than this, Azure's gone beyond traditional infrastructure as a service, and they're beginning to pack up things such as worker roles and web roles. There are opportunities to be explored as to whether our total solution package can't leverage these roles under a platform as a service model to further divest ourselves of the administration and service around the infrastructure. Now, this is an emerging space for Azure, and as yet, I don't think that either AJ and I could probably cite anybody who's done this in a SharePoint context, so it warrants watching an investigation. But we wanted to call out that this escalation from infrastructure as a service up the chain towards platform and software as a service is creating new opportunities for us to house these workloads and divest ourselves of the burden.
I think one of the most exciting areas for me with this is the prospect of the connectivity aspects that the Azure services provide. So, and just to put that into context, if you were to have, for example, a Salesforce as your CRM, and you have a SharePoint instance, either cloud or on-premises, Azure provides almost tool sets or tools to connect those systems together. Now, previously, and I'm not saying that you plug this in and they talk, that is a part of what they do, but they provide a basis upon which to do that securely and reliably. They almost provide that foundation for you to have these systems interact, and then, of course, impose any of your customizations within that connection to make that connection work and work for your business. So this whole space of connecting things together via Azure and secure and reliable and cost-effective, I suppose, in many ways, is promising, and I think that's worth understanding if it helps. If we're looking to learn more, I think that's a good place to start into looking at what are the opportunities above and beyond just doing servers, that kind of thing.
As a subset where these things might actually provide a lot of value would be the hybrid scenarios. Now, hybrid, again, is a subtopic or, I guess, a sub-discussion for today's high-level view that we don't have time to drill into. But hybrid can go a number of different ways, and ultimately they center around the concept that we may not move everything to the cloud. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. There may be aspects of our total solution landscape, and there may be aspects of the content and functionality in SharePoint itself that we need to run in a hybrid way, which means we keep our on-premises and we connect it to SharePoint Online or another instance in the cloud in ways that gain advantages from both sides. There are a number of reasons why we might look to do so. It may be that some content, for example, has a compliance constraint. It isn't ready to leave the house yet. That would be but one example. There may also be advantages where the functionality that SharePoint brings us is something that we want to expose for certain external parties or edge cases by leveraging what's available in SharePoint Online. For example, project sites shared with other parties or externalizing some of that interaction and collaboration in a way that we can better separate it from our internal affairs. There are all kinds of edge cases where those tools would become extremely valuable, but we wouldn't necessarily want to move everything we have at home out into that space. The connectivity between them depends on the configuration, and again, that's a rabbit hole we can't go down today, but we would argue that there are many different services and tools in Azure that can be brought to bear in terms of moving content, in terms of assisting with our authentication and identity management problems, and it's a toolkit that really you must be aware of as we go forward into the Microsoft world. So with that and the mention of tools, let's talk about tooling and testing. We're not going to belabor this heavily, but suffice it to say there are quite a few free and third-party tools out there that can help us on this journey. Not the least of which is our pair of hands and our pair of eyes. Let's start there. Our ability to engage users in assessing the content that we have in SharePoint, in assessing the content that we have in file shares, is a good example of a human tool coming to bear. However, there are other utilities that can help us there. Before we name names, and we're not going to spend a lot of time naming names, let's talk about some principles here. We must never rely solely on tools. There is always going to be planning and there's always going to be manual effort involved. There is no single tool in the marketplace today that will make your entire migration point-click easy. It's not going to happen. And in fact, we would argue that potentially that would be a silly thing to do anyways, that in fact we're missing a golden opportunity to restructure what we do. So start out by not relying on the tools to be the blue pill or the red pill.
Think of a tool as something that can either potentially, firstly, is a time saver. It can make a movement, cut down something from days to minutes or hours. It also may ensure quality of a migration as well, of moving something as well. So other than that, the decisions that need to be made, the mapping, the finding, the hooking in, the telling the tool to do what it should do are human manual things that need to be carried out.
Absolutely. And above all, keep things simple. Don't migrate something that doesn't need to be migrated, and don't evaluate a dimension or an aspect or a piece of metadata if it has no bearing on the migration or how the content's going to be used in the future. Don't waste your time with those kinds of exhaustive studies. And in fact, we've had conversations with some clients that wanted to go as far as doing heuristic analysis over what kind of document the file represented, rather than just relying on file type or file name or organizational classification. And those tools are available in the marketplace. On the very high end of the scale, you can find artificially intelligent products that will just about read and understand your information at a cost. We would argue there's not necessarily that much value in those. As tempting as they are to completely automate the process, the reality is going to be a pretty far cry from the brochureware. Another key point here, AJ and I are passionate about, is working along dimensions. What do we mean here? If I know the types of files, the sizes of the files, the users of the files, the departments of the files, the information types of the files, I've got a number of different dimensions that I can use if I'm going to be doing a content-only migration to batch it. Yes, there are times when you would shotgun everything over, but more often than not, if you're dealing with a wide user base, there are going to be considerations about what's convenient for them. Remember, we have to put the customer at the center of our universe here. So creating disruption through a shotgun approach isn't always the best thing to do. And in fact, in recent projects, we have found that a better approach is to deal with each batch of content discreetly according to the business conditions that are the reality for those individuals at that time. Whether it's an ongoing cyclical business process that they can't disrupt themselves from, or whether it's the fact that certain content types they're working with are more or less relevant day to day than other kinds. You've got dimensions that you can cut the workload into chunks.
It may appear to make sense to move through team by team and address people's needs that way, but be mindful of the fact that teams interact together. The white space of the org chart is a very colourful place, and it is where a lot of the real work takes place, the cross-functional things that you do, projects, event management, product development, committees, meetings, executive-style meetings, all the information that's related to those cross-functional things, and it will make sense to move that sort of thing together. Considerations, though, therefore, that training needs to be obviously considered for users if they are not SharePoint users already. That is complementary to that approach. You won't be training sequentially in a team-based mode. You may need to train everyone who's a member of a project up front first. They may not see their team content coming across for a couple of months. So it's important to understand that picking the means of movement is as much about ease of batching as it is about how will our users come along for the ride with this.
And for all of these reasons, we have to give ourselves enough time.
Correct.
Right back to the beginning of our discussion today, the positioning of our business case is less about determining the fixed budget and time frame that we have to conduct this work in, but understanding really the way the business needs this to happen. And allowing and setting an expectation, allowing enough time and setting the right expectations with our key stakeholders that this is going to be potentially an organic process. It may stop and start at different times. It may have gaps in between batches. The batches may not follow the same dimension from the next one. One might be departmental, the other might be file type based. There are a number of different ways to approach it, and we need to combine all of them to get the best result. Beyond this, do trial runs. Whether we are spinning up environments in Azure or a private host, or whether we are creating tenants inside of Office 365, we have the opportunity to take small trial runs. And I think AJ, prior to our discussion today, pointed something out as well. It was extremely valuable. Make running trials an ongoing process throughout the project. Don't just siphon your testing at the very front. Don't isolate it to just the front. We need to be in a continuous trial run or trialing process as we move through our content batches and departments.
Yeah, if you can think about moving content as a bit of a sort of a supply chain, if you will, there's many working parts and dependencies on networking, tools, licenses for products, that sort of thing, and being able to regularly, even on a bi-weekly basis, run a little trial through, run a test batch through, just to make sure that everything's in order and everything's running. The last thing you want to do is go to kick off migration and all of a sudden you've got an authentication issue and nothing's working anymore, and delaying yourselves progress when you've done so much work to get everybody on board and come along with you. So, yeah.
So just to touch on tools, there are, as we mentioned, a wide array of tools emerging in the marketplace, and in fact it's quite a hot space for app development at the moment, with everybody looking to move to the cloud. Of those icons you see on the screen now, there are some that we've worked with closely and some that we haven't worked with closely yet, some that we're looking at. Some are desktop-based, some are server-based, and some are cloud-based. In the case of Cloudyway, there's a newcomer, well, relative newcomer to the marketplace we're kind of interested in, runs as a service. We have smaller utilities that are nipping at the heels of the giants like ShareGate that offer a tremendous amount of capability to move existing site topology or document libraries from point A to point B. And in fact, ShareGate and Nintex made an announcement this morning that they'll be partnering in the coming year to open up migration pathways in ShareGate for Nintex workflow and forms, which is pretty exciting. We hope to see something come out of that quickly.
Yep.
And of course, there are other players in the marketplace, large and small. We've also included the PowerShell icon at the top just to call out that depending on the type of migration you're faced with, particularly if you have access internally or through vendors to technical resources to help you through the process, don't forget good old PowerShell. PowerShell is an extremely powerful utility that in some cases can be used to provide a great deal of automation around provisioning and around migration activities. More on that if you're interested. So migration and post-migration. Now we've come to the day we're actually going to push a button and do something. And in our last few minutes, we'll skim through quickly. Determine and control our interruptions or disruptions to business by using batching. We've talked about that. We need to assume from the start that we may be faced with a rinse and repeat process, even if we're doing an attach-detach methodology or a bulk shotgun approach. Things can go wrong, and there are many points in the chain, particularly network behavior, that can influence our migration processes. They may have to be repeated. Use testing to try and nut out most of the problems. Be flexible. Stay flexible. Don't rule out the obvious. Depending on the type of migration and the volume of content you're dealing with, good old-fashioned techniques like posting a hard drive to the vendor or having something couriered over or moving a whole VM are still viable options in many scenarios.
And those services are offered by a lot of the cloud providers. It's a priority, courier a disk in, and they'll move that content for you. So there are alternatives, always alternatives.
Indeed. And when we look at Azure, and perhaps sometime this year 365, there's a feature called, or a service called ExpressRoute that we're looking into that provides effectively a direct network connection, bypassing many of the internet hops that you would normally go through to access Azure services. That's available today. And there's a blog entry out there that will talk about how they're going to open that up to 365 in the near future. So these are things to be considering. With regards to redesign and version upgrades, as I think we've touched on, we need to consider these very carefully in the context of a migration. Sometimes it makes sense to mix them all up and do them as a single project. Sometimes it doesn't. We might be compounding the complexity of our project management significantly if we're not careful. Ultimately, we need to create a repeatable, consistent procedure for each of our content sources. We need to ensure that data quality and readiness is assessed early. We need to establish clear mappings between our locations and functions, and we need to break things up into manageable pieces. We need to spot check content after the migration. We need to engage users for feedback. We need to keep our communications wide and regular. And we need to also keep our old systems online, at least in a read-only fashion for a time.
And these points are really about, these are key ones for engaging the business and bringing them along for the journey. Migrations should never take place in isolation. They should not be a technical delivery. Oh, this is an IT thing. I think we mentioned that earlier on. These getting users, getting the business in to spot check content with you is a chance for them to learn. It's a chance for them to feel part of what's been the journey that you're taking. They will feel good about feedback, and they will relish the opportunity to deliver that to you as well.
So just wrapping up, as I can see we have gone a minute over. Apologies for that. There are a few scenarios that are more common than others that we encounter. First of all, moving an existing SharePoint into the SharePoint Online space. I think we've probably talked through most of these points. There will be service differences, licensing changes, and as always, an opportunity for restructure or change. Moving to VMs or exploring the potential of using platform as a service roles in Azure, retaining our server licensing, keeps the door open on bulk or shotgun approaches using attached methodologies. We're going to maintain service parity with, in most cases, with the on-premise capability that we have today. In both cases, we have to ask questions about authentication and also integration, as we've talked about. There are other options. There are many different roads you can take, but these two are very popular or common.
A lot of the questions we feel that center on those topics. Yeah.
So some additional resources: Ignite, Fast Track, Office.Microsoft.com, and also a link in the deck we'll provide to you regarding the SharePoint limits. That's available up on TechNet. It's good material. We were reminded that there was an offer being made out to attendees of the webinar, so we'll extend that now. Similar to our past webinars, we are able to offer, as long as it is within a reasonable drive distance from our CBD locations, we're able to offer a free consultation effectively regarding migration or information management more broadly in SharePoint on your premises with one of our consultants. And if you are interested in that kind of feedback, please get a hold of Empire via the website. All of our details are listed there, so I won't bore you with them. And with that, we'd like to close for today, say thank you very much for listening to us ramble on. Given the breadth of the topic, AJ and I are contemplating that we might actually do some subordinate, smaller, tighter engagements around different aspects of the migration problem. We'll keep you posted on that, so stay tuned. Everybody have a great day and a fantastic weekend. Thanks again.